My name is Aaron Rubio. I'm the Director of Student Services for Walton County Schools. We have a couple of guests who want to welcome you this morning. Want to invite them up to the stage. First up, we have the Superintendent of Walton County Schools, Dr. Nathan Franklin.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Walton County. I'm Nathan Franklin, Superintendent of Walton County School District. It is a pleasure to host this event, and thank you ahead of time for the work you have done and will be doing. Today should be packed with so many new opportunities to go back and serve our students, the non-academic barriers to learning. Thank you for embracing what we wanted to push out in our community, not just in Walton County. But hope you have a great conference, and thank you for your service. Mayor?
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Howard. I'm the mayor of the city of Monroe. Dr. Franklin and I were talking earlier just a little bit ago about the perfect day, the one where all the kids come in, don't have any parental problems. They listen to what you say, they write it all down in the notebooks, they come back and do the perfect project, and then you all go home and everything's perfect. That doesn't exist. And I'm so proud that you can overcome the day-to-day to teach our children. I just appreciate all that you do, and I thank you for being here, and I thank y'all for putting this on. Welcome to Monroe. You can go stick out and about.
Thank you for being here, guys. We have a great lineup of speakers. Really excited to hear what they all have to say. So I just want to take a couple of minutes just to kind of explain this to you, share where it came from. So about a year ago, I was contacted with an opportunity to partner with a keynote speaker in his organization. And when it came to me, I jumped up. I thought, what a great opportunity to provide him and his mentor support for Walton County Schools, our families, and all that. Pretty early in the planning process of that, my team and I, we realized this was an opportunity that was far greater than just Walton County Schools or even focused on Walton County. We felt like this was something that we needed to offer to the surrounding area and anyone who would be interested in partaking in this. So that was kind of the initial inspiration for having a conference, for having you all here with us. So thank you for partaking with that. So then R3, we felt like we needed to have some kind of a theme. We needed to do a conference or a gathering. We want to have some kind of a message you're trying to accomplish. We didn't want it to be the same thing. There's a lot of good self-help professional conferences out there and trainings out there. We wanted this to be a little bit different. So in thinking it through, we kept coming back to, we landed on 3 words. They all happen to start with R. So I just want to talk about this. The first word, resiliency. This is a word we've heard far too much in the last 3 years, have we not? This is the official definition. I really like this last portion, strength of character. I like that part. That really resonates with me. There is a very wise man many years ago who experienced much more difficult troubles than any of us have. And in a letter that he wrote to some friends, he said, we should count it all joy when we experience struggles. Because troubles produce patience. Patience produces character. Character produces what? Hope. Hope. Could we all do with a little more hope? But we didn't want to just end with resiliency, because I'll be honest with you, I'm tired of hearing the word resiliency. After what we've been through the last 3 years, you can be resilient. I'm like, okay, listen, no, we hear that anymore. So we wanted to offer a little bit more than just that. So the next word is recovery. And so here's the official definition, but I want to give you a kind of a different idea of what recovery is. Think of it this way. Recovery is striving to get to the way things were before it happened. And we all have to get to, we all have some, we all have some of them. Whether it's a divorce, a loss of a job, financial stress, the death of or loss of a loved one, or a pandemic. We all have it, some of us have a lot of it. But recovery is striving to get to the way things were before you now. The next word is renewal. So if recovery is trying to get to the way things were before you now, think of renewal as trying to get to the way things could be, or maybe even the way things should be. There's an ancient Japanese practice. Go to the next slide. One before that. There's an ancient Japanese practice called kintsugi. If you've ever heard of it. No, that's not it. There you go, that's it. There's an ancient Japanese practice called kintsugi. And what this is they take broken items and through a painstaking practice of sanding down the rough edges, finding the edges to go back together. They glue it back together, and then they paint it, seal it with a golden paint. And the end result ends up being something that is more durable, stronger, more valuable, and more beautiful than the original piece was. So, our hope here today, go to the home slide. Our hope here today is that you will hear something in the course of the presentations that we're going to have here today that will help you identify and maybe even embrace the brokenness that you may have in your life and help put those pieces back together in a way that will be more beautiful than the original was. And it will help you to do the same for others. That's my hope. All right, ready to begin the journey? It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. I've heard him speak many times, so you're in for a treat. If you've never heard him speak, he is a developmental behavioral pediatrician in Los Angeles. He's also a professor at the University of Southern California. He is, I think it's fair to say, one of the experts in grief in not only this country but in the world, not only in grief and grief recovery. He has a lot of information and helpful advice for all of us. So, Georgians, will you please give a good Southern warm welcome to Dr. David Schonfeld.
Good morning, it's a pleasure to be here again. So we look forward to coming back to Monroe. What I wanted to do is, I'll start a little bit by giving you some introduction about the National Center for School Crisis and Grieving. I'm going to keep that fairly brief. Then I'll go into a discussion of really how do we support students in the aftermath of both the crisis and loss. I am leaving plenty of time for questions and discussion if you want, so please think about points as they come up so that we can have some discussion. Actually, if you advance to the next slide, then you can go to this slide after. So I wanted to start by just giving you a little bit of a sense of our center. If you go to the next slide. So the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement was established in 2005 with funding from the September 11th Children's Fund and the National Philanthropic Trust. But it was actually an extension of a program that I started at Yale over 30 years ago. And we've been doing this work continuously since that point. And the core funding now is provided mainly by the New York Life Foundation. But the center was created to promote an appreciation of the role that schools can serve to support students, staff, and families at times of both crisis and loss, to enhance training of individuals in school-related professional education programs in the areas of crisis and loss, and also to serve as a resource for information, training materials, consultation, and technical assistance. And because of our funding, we're able to provide technical assistance to schools across the country and no cost to the schools. So that's why I'm going over this. So if you have a question that comes up or you have an issue that's affecting your school, you can contact our center. I will show you some of the contact information at the end. We are available 24/7. My only request is you recognize that the center is actually in Los Angeles. So when you first come into work, if you really just want to go short, I want to hold on calling us because they will wake us up.
and middle of the night for that. So we are available though if you want to discuss or talk through. We get now about 2 to 3 consults per week. We've been doing this work for over 30 years, so we've gotten a lot of experience in supporting schools, and we do a lot of that support in person. The Brave of Heart Fund is the group that is funding our current work in Walton Public Schools. So I just want to acknowledge their support. I wasn't going to go over any more of the background of the center, but I just wanted to let you know that that's where we come from. Our philosophy work with schools is a little bit different than some other programs. Our philosophy has been that a school response to a crisis is not the same as a clinical approach applied to every child in a school. So you will find, if you look at the recovery efforts, the renewal efforts after the COVID-19 pandemic, school and community-based shootings, which unfortunately our country has a lot of experience with, the escalating severe natural disasters and a wide range of other major crises, they all underscore the need to really move from the exclusive use of the medical model. As a pediatrician, I was trained in the medical model. You screen, you identify, you evaluate, you diagnose, and you treat. That's not really what we should be doing as our primary focus in these major events such as the pandemic. Really what we need to do is move more towards a system of universal supports for the tier 1 services that you're used to providing in schools, and take it as our primary response to these events, the goal of building resilience rather than delivering treatment. So it's a different framework, I think, that we use, and I can go over, and if people have questions on that, why that is so important. But we have found the vast majority of individuals are going to have experienced significant distress after these events. And if you just try and screen, evaluate, diagnose, and refer for treatment those who have some form of mental illness, you will actually miss the majority of individuals, and the vast majority of people that you actually do refer will not receive that treatment, even if it is accessible and free of charge. So we really think the primary goal should be to build that base of the pyramid, the tier 1 services, and building resiliency. And then you also need to provide support to those who need more than that, which is primary thrust should be more on building resiliency. Some of this is based on our appreciation that schools can and do provide a supportive environment to both students and staff in the aftermath of crisis and loss. Now that doesn't require that we need to educate educators on how to be mental health professionals. I think sometimes it's very understandable. It's difficult enough to teach on a good day. It's hard to teach when you're in the midst of a crisis or the aftermath of a crisis. And then to layer on that an expectation that classroom educators will somehow be equipped or skilled to be able to start evaluating mental health needs of their students and delivering therapeutic services in classroom settings. It's not really realistic, but that doesn't mean that classroom educators and all educators, they can provide a very important role by being supportive and helping students adjust to the crisis events in their lives without providing any treatment or therapy. So what I'm going to show you in just a second is a video clip. It's about 90 seconds long, and it's a classroom educator that talks about returning, a student returning to the classroom after the death of his mother, and how she provides support. And I just like it because I mean, the content of what she's saying, but she also comes across as an empathic and supportive educator. And that's what we want all our classrooms filled with. So if you advance to the next slide, we should start automatically.
2 years ago, I asked you to come back from the funeral. And the kids told me that his mother was in the hospital, and that's why he hasn't been in school. I said, oh, okay. So then when he came back, I said, Jonathan, he said, my mom passed. I had no idea. No one warned me. And I said, Jonathan, and I hugged him, and then I looked at him, and I was gonna lose it because my heart, my mother, and he looked at me and he goes, Jackie, please don't. And I said, okay. So he didn't want to talk about it. And the only thing I let him know is, when you're ready, I'm here. And we're all here. And my door is always open. And, maybe 3 weeks later, he came to me and said, thank you. And I look up from my desk. What are you thanking me for? He said, I just want you to know thank you. And I said, you know, Jonathan, you're welcome. And I don't know what I did. He goes, you were here and I didn't have to talk about it. So I realized then, you know, I wish I realized that sooner. Sometimes you don't want to talk about it. You want to be somewhere where you can forget that you're grieving. So I think you have to, as an educator, it's like a dance. I'm going to take a step forward. If you start the dance with me, I can take the next step. If they stop and they're not able to, okay, we can stay here and just listen to the music.
I think it's a really nice metaphor, because I think that's a lot of what we're doing now is we're just listening to music with kids. But unfortunately, many educators don't know the dance moves, and it doesn't come easily to some people. So we really have to help them understand, how do you provide that type of support? So one model of providing universal support after a crisis event is referred to as psychological first aid. And this is provided in the immediate aftermath of a major crisis event, and it's provided broadly to all those who've been impacted by the crisis. It is not a treatment service. You don't screen individuals before you provide psychological first aid, you just provide it to a population. So I'll give you a typical type example. Most people who are providing psychological first aid may have limited training in mental health, and they often try and deliver the services population-wide by individual to individual, but usually in about 10 to 15 minutes. The scenario might be that 9/11 happens, and then the next morning, people with psychological first aid training go to train stations that are along the train line from Manhattan onto Long Island, and they meet people in the parking lot as they're coming to pick up cars that were not picked up the day before. So high likelihood some of those people may be individuals who had lost someone in the World Trade Center attack. You approach them, you provide psychological first aid in the parking lot for 10 to 15 minutes, and then you move on to the next call. So I'm going to be talking about how you provide PFA. Please understand, you're in a school setting, most of you, or clinical settings. So you have the opportunity to see people over time, and the same thing with classroom educators. The same type of approach is going to be taught to people to use it very briefly. And with psychological first aid, what you're doing is providing what we call psychoeducation. You're helping individuals understand both the impact of crisis as well as what they can do to minimize some of the negative impact of the crisis events. And you're really trying to provide supportive services to foster effective and normative coping strategies, just to accelerate the healing process. It's not a treatment, it's just a supportive intervention to help people heal faster. What I want to make is that all adults that are working with children should understand the likely reactions that they have when they are experiencing crisis, whether it's a major crisis that affects the community or whether it's a personal or family crisis. Kids come to school upset every day, some of them, hopefully not all of them every day, but you will see children upset, and you want to be sure that you can support them through that. If you go to the next slide, the reason we want everyone to do that is that anyone that interacts with children and their families can be a potential source of assistance and support. But if they're unprepared, particularly if they appear disinterested, they can actually become a source of further distress. So an example I have from Gibbs, I remember my daughter was running late to school one morning. She was in high school, and she missed the bus. It was the first time that had happened. And she said, Dad, I gotta get to school, I'm gonna be late. So I said, okay, go over to school. I pull up in front of the school, and she goes, oh no, I forgot my lunch. I said, okay, you get out and go to class so that you're not late. I'll go pick up your lunch and I'll bring it back to the office. So I go back and I bring the lunch to the office and I give it to the administrative assistant, and she looks at me and she goes, you shouldn't do this. And I'm like, oh, is this the wrong person to give it to? Should I bring it someplace else? And she goes, no, you shouldn't do this. I go, why wouldn't I do this? She forgot her lunch. I'm bringing her lunch. And she said, well, if you do that, she's just going to forget her lunch every day. Now, I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician. I actually give workshops on parenting. I did not go into that with her. She did not appear interested or open to that. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't think that's the case. I'm missing now. She's in her 30s. That's the only time she missed the bus, and it's the only time that she forgot her lunch. So I was actually right. But that's so I just looked at her and I said, well, you haven't seen her when she hasn't eaten lunch. This is really for the safety of the class. She just looked at me and she said, you still shouldn't do it. And I walked out, and now I wasn't in crisis, nothing bad had happened. I actually had time to drop her off. So I wasn't upset, but my reaction was, my daughter is right, the school doesn't care about the kids. Now, that is the impression that I had leaving the school. And actually, it's a very good public school system, and they have wonderful teachers, but all you need is one insensitive, negative, uncaring comment, particularly when you're in crisis, and it really shapes how you see the entire school system, or the entire clinic, or medical center. So you want everyone trained in how to do this. And I did some training for the Flight 93 Memorial. I don't know if any of you have ever gone to the Flight 93 Memorial. It's outside Pittsburgh. It's in a secluded area. So Flight 93 was a flight that was en route and diverted towards Washington, D.C. on 9/11. And so what happened was the World Trade Center attack occurred. They grounded all the planes in airspace in the United States. And this flight did not. This flight kept going. And there were terrorists on board, and the crew and the staff were, of course, aware that the terrorists had taken over the plane because they were flying towards Washington, D.C. But they also knew what happened at the World Trade Center because they had some cell phone communications during this period when they were under siege by the terrorists. And so they decided collectively to take down the plane and sacrifice their own lives so that they wouldn't be used to kill others. So they went down outside of Pittsburgh in a very rural area. I think that was, of course, intentional, so that they wouldn't harm good people. And there is now a national park that's dedicated to their memory and a visitor center that tells some of their story. So anyway, so we were going and doing training there to all the staff who worked there. And somebody came up afterwards and said to me, I oversee some of the groundskeeping here. And I have actually trained the people that if they're plowing the lawn and they see a visitor, they're to stop what they're doing, establish eye contact, and ask if they can be of assistance. And he looks at me and he goes, this is sacred ground. We are not here to cut the grass. We're here for the visitor experience. Now, part of me is thinking, yeah, you're here to cut the grass. Like, it's a national park, you have a lot of grass, that is your job. You are actually here to cut the grass. But the fact that you have an understanding of the higher mission of what this location is for is really extraordinary. And so if you have someone who is hired to cut the lawn in school, or they're there as a custodian, or they're there as a cafeteria worker, whatever their role is, they need to understand that they're there for the student experience. And that is the overarching goal. And so I think everyone should be trained in psychological first aid. It helps your institution. It also, of course, helps the children in them. We also have observed that support professionals often have a unique perspective to students. So I went to one school that had a mass shooting, and I was talking to some cafeteria workers, and they looked at me and said, we're noticing the girls are wearing long-sleeve shirts. I said, why do you think that's significant? So, they get on the lunch line and hold out their trays, and we see their sleeves retract, and then we notice that they're cutting more. So they're wearing long-sleeve shirts to cover the cutting that's increased after the shooting. So I looked at myself, did you talk with the school mental health professionals? And I'm like, no, we work in the cafeteria. They're not really looking for anyone. So they had an observation that was really very important. It would help the school and the recovery efforts. And then the custodians were there, and the custodians said, yeah, and the kids are having sex on campus with each other during school hours. We know who they are, and we know where it's happening. So they literally have a very different perspective on students and see things that most of us do not see. And we need to draw them into the experience of providing the support. One of the groups that works with the coalition, was a founding member of the coalition to support students that we direct, is the NEA, as well as the AFT. And for the NEA, we have been both the AFT, we've worked with their educational support professionals group. Which I'm going to speak at the conference next month, the NEA ESP conference. And so we find that we can do this training with educational support professionals, and they are very eager to learn this information, and they do a very good job. I went to one school to do training. They had a community mass shooting, and so I was there just doing training for all of the staff. And the principal asked me, who should I invite? I said, you can invite the entire staff. So after I had finished the training, which was about a 4-hour long, it was fairly extensive training, one of the cafeteria workers walked up to me and she said, "You know, I've been in this school for 25 years. This is the first time I've been invited to Professional Development Day." She said, "And this was personally and professionally relevant to me as a topic." She just said, "Thank you for recognizing support professionals provide support." So I think it's a very simple point, but we really need to recognize it and make sure that they're well equipped to do that. So let me go into, actually, if you advance to the next slide, I'll go over, I'm going to just summarize some of the psychological first aid actions as described by the American Red Cross in their model. So the first one is observational awareness, and I'm going to go over some of the common symptoms of adjustment reactions in other slides. The next step is to make a connection, help people feel comfortable and at ease, to be kind, calm, and compassionate. People tend to pick up on what I describe as the affective tone of what we were saying, more than the actual content of what we say when they are feeling in crisis. So we want to make sure that we not only deliver accurate information and in an appropriate way, but we also present it appropriately to children. So I'll give you an example. I had the opportunity to accompany a staff member who had just been diagnosed with cancer to her first visit with the oncologist, along with her husband. She asked me just to come along to help her understand what was going on and to provide support, although her husband was very supportive as well. So I was really there to kind of help her interpret what she had heard. So we go through the visit. The oncologist, I thought, did a very nice job. It was a lengthy visit of about 45 minutes to an hour. We walk out of the room, and she looks at me and she just said, "So I don't have cancer." I looked at her and I go, "Why do you think you don't have cancer?" And she said, "He seems so hopeful." And I'm like, "Well, you signed a permission form for surgery tomorrow to remove your tumor, and then you signed a separate form for your chemotherapy regimen, which is going to start the next day." I mean, he explained all of this pretty carefully to you. And she just said, "But he was so hopeful." I said, "He's hopeful you will be cured of cancer, that you do have cancer." And she actually was. This was like 20 years ago. And so, but she just kept saying, "But he seems so optimistic." She picked up only on the tone of what he was saying and not any of the content. And I do have to say, in case you're concluding, she was a very reasonable individual who worked with me, who was very good in crisis situations. She was not hysterical and did not even appear overwhelmed by the experience. But she really just picked up on the tone. So we want to make sure that people understand that it's not only what they say, it's how they say it, how they deliver the message, and that becomes important for psychological first aid. I'm told I'm very calming, which that's a problem, by the way, with long presentations. So if you want to get up at any point, put people to sleep, it's not a great thing. But I am told I'm very calming, and it isn't because I'm calm. It's just because I look that way. I sound that way. And I've always looked that way. Anyway, so the next step is you want to assist with people's basic needs. We did a lot of work in New Orleans after Katrina, over a dozen visits out there. During one of the visits, that was maybe about 3 months after Katrina, somebody came up to me and they said, "You know, in this Sunday, I was at church, and my minister was in the middle of giving a sermon, and someone's cell phone went off in the audience. And the congregation was kind of making comments about why would you keep your cell phone on, it's inappropriate." I actually just silenced mine before I started, but it's fine if your cell phone goes off. I don't know why that caused some stir, but anyway, it did. And so at that point, apparently the minister stopped his sermon, turned to the congregation, and said simply, "That call might be your contractor, you better take it." So the person that was telling me this said, "Our minister really gets us." And that's what you want, because basically what the minister was saying was, listening to the word of God is not as important as making sure that your family is safe and has a place to live, which is a really important message to deliver from those in leadership positions. So we want to make sure that we're attending to kids' basic needs, because otherwise they really aren't accessible for education or for learning. The next thing is to listen, and being able to actively listen is even more important than knowing what to say. So a lot of people say, "Well, what am I going to say?" And I usually tell them, you don't have to say anything, except just let them know you're listening to them. That accomplishes largely for psychological first aid. You want to give realistic reassurance, but not false reassurance. The goal is not to dismiss people's concerns, but if you can give reassurance because you actually know something, then would minimize some of their distress, and certainly should share that. You want to encourage good coping. People have questions. I had a slide that's optional that goes over some of the different coping strategies. And then we want to help people connect, help them identify supports in the family, school, and in the community, and help them figure out how they can help others, because helping others is a way to try and feel that you have more control of a situation. You also want to give accurate and timely information if the crisis is evolving. You don't want to give unnecessary or graphic details, but you want to let people know what's occurring so that they feel they understand what to do. So if you go to the next slide, because I saw in the pandemic that we're not living this well, I want to emphasize this. During a crisis, we all should watch our media consumption and make sure it's a healthy diet and don't consume too much of it. Adults should try to keep informed, but through focusing periodic attention to a trusted media outlet or other trusted sources of information. The bottom line is you don't want to listen to, watch, or read continual coverage, even when it is available. I find it useful to just remind myself and others that there are really two main reasons to watch, listen to, or read media coverage during a crisis. One is to be reassured, so to get reassuring information, and the other is to learn practical steps to keep yourself and those you care about safer. If you aren't getting more reassured and you're not learning new information that's practical, then you really just need to disconnect from media, whether that's television, social media, radio, or print, at least for a period of time. And you want to advise children and other adults also limit their media exposure during a crisis. It's really just a good time to unplug and be with people, either in person or remotely if you can be there in person. I think during the pandemic, we weren't doing this. There was a lot that was on the news, quote, to educate people, and it really didn't educate them, and it didn't help them feel reassured. You know, if you know how to wash your hands, stay 6 feet away from someone, wear a mask when you're in public when the virus is spreading, but once you get those points, which, let's be honest, it really doesn't take that long to learn those, it's pretty simple. Once you've got that down, you don't need to keep hearing that, and you certainly don't need to keep hearing that there is yet another variant. There always are new variants. Viruses mutate, and so there's always going to be new variants. I just saw something that I read yesterday, it was like, this might be a variant of concern. Yeah, it might be, it might not be. But there's nothing you're gonna do differently. Wash hands the same way. We can keep telling people it might get worse, but I don't understand it's not reassuring, and it doesn't give them anything practical to do. And I don't even keep track of the different names of the different variants. So there was just all this information that was just sensitizing and not helpful. Now, some people do like hearing more information. I will tell you, I was in my house with my wife and daughter for 10 months, and I think without anybody really leaving. My wife played the radio continuously. I could probably, every time I go in the room, I'd turn the radio off, she'd turn it back on, turn it on. It was kind of like, you do know I'm lecturing this, like, this is not good, you should have it. So if any of you can contact her and just ask her to turn the radio on, she still does it, it's really kind of annoying. But anyway, that would take more than my allotted hour to the winter. So the point is there are people with different types of strategies, but in general, we don't need to share information that isn't helpful to people. We should be just sharing information that's either going to reassure or be a call to action for them. Go to the next slide. This is going back to the same list. Then you want to suggest a referral resource, or as I said, be aware of school and community mental health resources so you can offer them to students and families. And then the hardest step is to end the conversation, because really this should be done quite briefly. So with that in mind, I just want to underscore again, we want everyone to be trained in psychological first aid, but we also have to recognize that most adults underestimate the amount of distress that children are having in a crisis situation. Whether those be parents or educators, they tend not to see the distress the kids are having. If we do a good job, we can observe their behavior, but you can't observe people's feelings. They actually have to tell you about their feeling. So if you go to the next slide, this was one of the posters that was put up in New York City about 6 months after 9/11 by Project for Liberty. They all have the same tagline of only the signs were this easy to read. But they're not. Kids don't necessarily show you or tell you how they're feeling. Children may actually withhold complaints of their reactions because of concerns that they're somehow abnormal or at least inappropriate, or because they're trying to protect the adults around them who are visibly upset. So they are not going to add, believe it or not, a lot of kids don't want to add burden to adults, particularly in a crisis situation, so they withhold their concerns. And then, in turn, the educators often avoid discussion of troubling events in order to not contribute to student distress, afraid that they're going to just upset children or say or do the wrong thing and make matters worse. So a lot of times people say to me, if I don't know what to say, it's better to say nothing. And I tell them, saying nothing is exactly the wrong thing to say. It communicates to kids either that you're completely uninformed, that you're unconcerned about their distress, you don't believe they can handle it even if you talk to them, or worse, you don't even want to bother to make the effort. These are all bad messages in a crisis situation. My younger daughter was in fourth grade when 9/11 happened. And we were in a community that was commuting distance from us. And actually her friend's mother commuted to the World Trade Center. She didn't go into work that day, but it was a community that was deeply impacted. She was in a school that was K-4, and they decided not to tell the students what happened that day. So they hid all communications about 9/11 to the students. A lot of parents came and picked up their kids, but they established a rule very quickly that if a parent came to pick up the child was to come to the office. The teacher was to deliver all of the students' belongings with the student. If he or she forgot anything, they were not permitted to go back to class. So they actually blocked the communication. So my fourth grader found out after school, when she was home alone with the older sister who watched it on television. Both extremes were inappropriate. And so they had to process this alone until I was able to make it home. And my wife was able to make it home. So I talked to the school. The principal called me out that evening and said, we didn't know what to do. So we didn't know. And I know it was the wrong thing to do. But we have an in-service tomorrow morning before school where we're going to train the teachers on what to say. We are planning on you being the speaker. I was like, okay, fine, I'll come in and talk. So I worked with the school. They did a lovely job. And her fourth grade teacher, probably the best teacher any of my kids ever had. She was wonderful. She had it for 2 years. And she was kind of the warmest, most sensitive educator I've had. But my daughter in her class said, I knew something was going on because the teachers were hugging each other. They just didn't know what it was. So she knew there was something bad, but she didn't know what it was. And she knew it wasn't being communicated to her. That's pretty scary for a kid. And then she looked at me and she said, I guess my teachers are uncomfortable with this. I will never talk about 9/11 in school. I was like, dear, you can talk to your teacher. She's incredible. Like, she really is. And she looked at me and she goes, no, it obviously makes her uncomfortable. I don't want to do anything to make her uncomfortable. I will never speak about it, but she never did in school. She talked to us about it, but she never addressed it in school. So that message was very powerful to her, and I think you just need to recognize not saying anything is definitely not the right thing to say. So if we go on to the next slide, let me go over the kind of types of reactions that you may see in children. So I do want to kind of underscore again that the most common reaction you won't find in the slide, and that's nothing. Please don't assume that you're going to see reactions in children. We need to provide support and assistance to children who have been through very difficult experiences, even when they appear fine. But let me go over some of the reactions that we find. So one is fears. You can have fears related to the crisis. So, if it's been a tornado, they become afraid of severe weather. We find in kids who've been to shootings, they become afraid of loud noises. This is kind of understandable. But they can also become more fearful in general, so they can develop anxiety. So that would include fears that are not specific to the crisis event. They may become afraid of the dark, even if the crisis event happened daily. And so sometimes they don't understand that, but why am I just afraid of everything? It's because you're more fearful, because you're anxious. We also find that one of the types of reactions that we see, the way that anxiety can present itself, is through school avoidance. So when there has been a crisis event, children will be reluctant to separate from their parents to go to school, and the parents will be reluctant to send their children to school. And that happens even when there are natural disasters that occur during the weekend. So obviously, if there's a school shooting or virus that's circulating in a public setting such as a school, there's a little bit more logic that people anticipate that type of school avoidance. But we see that even when it is completely unrelated. And it's actually more dangerous to be at home than it is to be in school, but they don't want to be apart from those they care about, who may protect them, or that they feel they can somehow protect. So you really need to reach out to people who haven't returned to school after crisis events. They're the ones I'm actually most concerned about. And sometimes it's subtle. I know in my own clinic, we had patients after the pandemic was starting to resolve, and they said, how are things going in school? And I go, oh, well, no, we're homeschooling. And I go, why aren't you homeschooling before the pandemic? And they go, no. I go, then why did you choose to do that? And they go, well, it seemed to work. Yeah, I didn't think it didn't work. Okay, so I'm like, yes, in what way? Describe a little more to me how that worked. And they would go, well, it seemed to work, so we just want to continue there. Do you really want to continue? Have you now decided that homeschooling is the best educational system for your child, or are you just afraid for your child to go to school? And they look at me and they go, well, it's kind of both. And I feel like that's probably predominantly one, your child needs to go back to school, and then let's work on that. And so, but a lot of times I just go back, and I saw some headline yesterday, or maybe it was this morning in the news, a lot of schools lost track of people who didn't come back. Those are the things I worry about, is those kids who are unserved and struggling and not getting support and not in front of us so that we don't recognize it. So you really have to, I would encourage you, please look for the people who you've lost and make sure that they're doing okay. But usually when I tell people that they did this in one community outside New Orleans, they had actually doubled their population in 1 week. They had the most displaced students to their community. And they were understandably pretty overwhelmed. And, I remember talking with them and they said, we're a really kind of small rural community, but now like we have rush hour. I go, rush hour. And they go, well, it used to take me 5 minutes to school, now it can take me 15 minutes. And I was like, you do know I live in Los Angeles, like, did you really say that to them? That's why I have an issue. So I'm like, I don't think we can call that a rush hour, but okay, it's more, it's a little bit longer. But the issue is that they were really overwhelmed. And so I went over with them when they told me that at this point, the majority of children who had relocated to the school, registered for school, and still not shown up for a day of school. It's like 3 or 4 months later. Now, this summer occurred as well during that time period, but it was still a sizable amount of time that the kids didn't come in. And I said, well, what are you doing for those students? And they're like, oh, nothing. Like, we're struggling with the doubling of our student population in a week. And the fact that the kids that are here are really given behavioral issues and learning problems, and we're really struggling to help them. And I said, yeah, but I'm most concerned about the ones who haven't shown up. I remember they looked at me and said, please tell us we don't have to do anything for them. And I'm like, you don't have to. I mean, yes, they're struggling in trailer parks that are very toxic and they're doing very poorly, but eventually they will show up and they will be frustrated and more distressed. And the other time they go, no, now we have to take care of it. Like, once you mentioned it, we care about the kids. I mean, it wasn't in school system. We care about the kids. It's just that we're just really struggling to take care of what's in front of us. Because remember, they doubled their population, but they didn't double their staffing. They didn't have any new teachers. So it's kind of like, this is an enormous, ask. And now you've just asked us to do more. And that's it, but you're right. We'll try and figure out how to reach out to them. So you do want to make sure that you're looking at fears and anxiety, including school ones. You want to find out, though, individual children's fears, concerns, or skepticism. Children may actually have very different fears than adults do, and adults have different fears than each other. And you really can't reassure people if you don't know what they're afraid of or concerned about. Otherwise, you usually aren't offering reassurance about their concerns, but rather you're telling them why you want concern. And when each person talks only from their own perspective, I call that arguing, and arguing is not helpful reassuring people. So we have to stop. People say, I'm worried about this. Our tendency is to say, oh, you don't need to be worried about that, or let me explain it to you. And really what we should be doing is say, could you tell me a little bit more about what worries you about them? Why are you concerned? And And then they'll show you what they're really worried about. And then you can and reassure them if appropriate. But you don't want to just start telling them why you are concerned. We also shouldn't tell children or adults they shouldn't be worried or minimize their concern. If they're worried, they're worried. And they have a right to be worried when worrisome things occur. But instead of telling them they shouldn't be afraid, you should tell them how they can manage their fear. What can you do to cope with your distress? Don't tell them that they shouldn't or don't have that distress, because that just means you're not listening to them and you're not giving them helpful information. The next thing on this slide is sleep problems, and that can be trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, difficulty waking in the morning, nightmares, or really any disruption in sleep. And when children or adults have disrupted sleep, they have a disruption of their functioning the next day, or sometimes for a couple of days at least. So it's really important that we help them manage their sleep problems. Now that does not mean that you medicate them, because medication actually does not help you learn how to fall asleep. It forces you into sleep and makes it less likely you'll know how to go to sleep on your own. So I've never written a prescription for sleep medication for a child who's been in a crisis situation. But we do spend a lot of time going over sleep hygiene. How do you try and set up an environment and have the child get ready to fall asleep, and what can they do? Self-calm and fall asleep. And you can also, by the way, changes in appetite and eating, increases or decreases in crisis situations. Now, one of the things that I was seeing a lot with the pandemic was people were saying, okay, my kid is staying up all night and then sleeps in the morning. This was when schools were closed. And I keep telling them, they shouldn't do that, since they should go to bed at a normal bedtime. And something like my teenager says to me, this is a normal bedtime. Everyone stays up to this hour. And they go, how do I know if they're depressed, using substances, anxious, having trauma symptoms, or they're just a teenager? And usually what I try to say to people is, look at the functional significance of what's going on. If you think about it, you can imagine back to 5 years ago. If I had sex with 5 years ago, what would you do if you were in a small, enclosed area with your child for 10 months and not able to leave? You would just go, that's ridiculous. People won't do that. Well, we did that to a certain extent. And so the issue is, when you're in that setting, it's not unreasonable as a kid to decide, if I can't physically distance, I'm going to social distance. So that means my parents go to bed at, let's say, 10:30. I stay until 1:30. I can text my friends. I got like 3 hours where it's almost like I'm on my own. And then I sleep another 3 or 4 hours in the morning when they're up. I get another 3-4 hours away from them. So that adds like a quarter of the day where it's better. And if you look at it that way, that's not a bad idea. Like, there's some functional benefit to that. It does not work, though, if you are going back to school, or you have online classes that start the next morning, or you wake up your parents when you're up, or they wake you up when they get up. So what I do is I say, don't talk about whether it's normal or abnormal. There was something normal about the pandemic. I thought that was a futile conversation. Talk about the functional impact. So then you can say to a child, well, it doesn't work. You're waking up your parents. Can you change that? Or do you have to more align your bedtimes with them? So it's kind of like, we tend to turn again to this diagnosis and talk about what's normal or abnormal. And in crisis situations, things are disrupted. And so I think in general, it's not a good idea to try and talk about whether it's normal or abnormal. Now, if you think the kid is depressed, suicidal, or is using substances, then yeah, you have to start to treat that. The vast majority of people in crisis situations are distressed. They're not necessarily ill. And we need to be thinking about the functional impact of what they're doing. So if you don't advance the slides, but the next thing on that slide is difficulty with concentration, and that will lead to problems with difficulty with academic performance in kids and difficulty with work performance in adults. Now, I'm going through the impact on children, but the same thing happens with adults. And so we have to be thinking about that as well. And so the next thing on the slide is sadness and depression. The goal is really to discern between the two. Sadness is to be expected in sad situations, but depression is more clinically relevant. So is it causing problems with day-to-day functioning, or is it gotten to the point where it requires clinical intervention? You can also see anger and irritability. Individuals who've been in crisis situations feel helpless and out of control. So as soon as they can exert some control, they will do it. And they will do it usually pretty vehemently. So back in, I started the training in April of 2020. We were working closely with New York City Department of Ed right during the height of them experiencing this. And I said to them, as soon as the schools start to open again, I will tell you there's going to be a disagreement about what it is safe among the students, the staff, and the families. They will all have disagreements within their groups. They will feel vehemently that they are right, and they will attack each other. You'll see it in public meetings, you'll see it in social media, you'll see it in public media. It gets ugly. And this happens all the time in crisis events, but this was a crisis that affected the whole world. So I'm like, it's gonna be like that, but like on steroids. It's just, you're gonna see, everyone's gonna disagree, and they're gonna be so angry. So I'm gonna talk about the political polarization. This is what happens in crisis situations. As soon as people feel they can exert control, they exert control. And they disagree, and they attack each other in the process. So the tensions that you see after crisis aren't to be anticipated. The next thing is alcohol or other substance use. So substance abuse evaluation and treatment services should be part of your crisis response plans. Sometimes I find kind of substance use evaluations are not typically done by many counselors, particularly if they have academic counseling background. And so they may not feel comfortable doing substance abuse evaluations. It's even among mental health professionals in general. So you need to make sure you have the capacity to be able to do that. I remember I went to China after the earthquake in Shen. There were, I think, 89,000 people that died in one day. A couple of massive collapses of buildings, including massive collapses of schools because of school construction in China at the time. So we were there, and I went to one resettlement community. And I was in a tent, and this school, that was a middle school, it had collapsed. About 40% of the teachers and staff died, and I think that 16 of the rest were dug in for them. And they had resettled to a new community, and they were there at that time. I think this was like 3 or 4 months after. So I'm talking to one of the teachers, and I'm like, "What are you seeing with the kids?" And he said, "Well, we've done home visits, and the kids are smoking more. They were middle school age kids, they had access to tobacco. You see increases in alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use. So the opioid epidemic worsening, more overdoses again. This is what you would expect after a disaster." So I looked at him and I said, "Well, how are you doing?" His principal was standing right next to him. He didn't even hesitate. He said, "I drank every night to fall asleep." And I've seen this among mental health professionals, physicians, same use of alcohol, other drug use. I was in New Orleans on one of the trips, and the mental health provider was hosting me, said, "You mentioned increase in drinking." Well, about 3 weeks after Katrina, my daughter texted me to ask me where I was after school. And I told her, "Don't worry, I'm with some friends from school and we're out at happy hour." And she just texted back, "Mom, you've been at happy hour every day since Katrina. You don't look happy to me at all." And she said, "I realized then I was drinking." So it's very common. I remember I was talking to a group of superintendents in the spring of 2020, and pretty early on in the pandemic, and one of them just said, "Oh no, I think I made a mistake. I sent wine to all of my staff." And I'm like, "Yeah, don't make it wine in the milk club. Stop it. It's not a good idea." But I will tell you, I attended in the fall of 2020 2 pediatric national conferences. They were all virtual because they couldn't be done in person. And in both of them, they were only a week apart. They both had virtual happy hours. They actually instructed people to get alcohol and bring it to the computers. And I'm like, why would you do that? Why would you encourage people to drink during a national crisis? So I tell people, do not use alcohol in school-sanctioned events around crisis events. I just think that's not the time to be distributing alcohol to people. So it does occur. Then you can see physical symptoms, headaches or stomach aches. That can be physical symptoms, emotional distress presenting as physical symptoms. We call that somatization. But it can also be that individuals are having worsening physical illness as a result of stress hormones. stress hormones increase blood pressure, you can bring on heart attacks and hypertension, and diabetes worsens because of the stress hormones effects on blood glucose. So, and then of course, you can have just the effect of whatever is causing the crisis. So if you have a child who's breathing quickly, you have to figure out, are they having a panic attack? Do they have an asthma attack because of the stress hormones? Or are they infected with COVID? And it could be any of the three. And often it's a combination. So please hug your schoolers if they wish to be hugged, if you feel it's appropriate. But be kind to your schoolers because they really have it tough during this situation. Children can also demonstrate post-traumatic symptoms, and some may meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. How many of you have not heard of PTSD? What's my assumption? So I'm not going to go over PTSD yet, not because it isn't important. It is definitely important after crisis events. But I think we've spent so much time on becoming trauma informed that we have forgotten our other things we have to do at the same time, like being grief sensitive. So I wanted to turn them to grief. This pandemic has caused widespread distress among most children and adults, but not all the distress is actually trauma symptoms. We tend to say whenever anything is distressing, it's traumatic, and that's used in the vernacular, but not in the mental health field. You have to be a little cautious that things can be distressing and not be traumatic. And the challenge is facing most children right now, and through much of the pandemic, was really more related to loss than it was to trauma per se. So I often tell this story. I was talking to an adolescent. He had been in a mass shooting in the community, and the person on either side of him was shot and killed, but he was not injured. And so he did not return to school for several weeks. He actually returned once, but only stayed for an hour or two. He had declined counseling. And so with his permission, through text message, he wasn't taking phone calls, but he did take text messages. I went to his home and I spoke with him and I said, why aren't you in counseling? And he said, they just keep wanting to talk about the shooting. He said, look, I had some trauma symptoms for about a week. Couldn't sleep well, it was jittery. He really understood this. He said, but they have improved. It's not bothering me. And I said, well, then why aren't you in school? And he said, well, I went there once and it didn't feel right. And why didn't it feel right? He said, it didn't feel right being there without her. He was on a date with a girlfriend that he planned on marrying, and she was found killed. And he said, being in school without her, it's not a problem. So I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. He paused, he thought about it, and he goes, that's it. And if someone is ready to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling today. I don't want to keep talking about the shooting. But no one offered to talk to him about his grief. He was in a very traumatic event, and they just assumed that all of his problems were post-traumatic. They're not. And so we have to be also looking for other types of issues, such as grief. And the interventions and supports we offer to children who are grieving are quite different than those we provide to people who have had trauma. At a very basic level, when you're managing trauma, what you're trying to do is help individuals cope with something that happened. But in grief, you're trying to help them cope with the persistent absence of something that was. So they are the opposites in many ways. And so the interventions are going to be very different. I was on the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission, and one of the parents, Amy, spoke to the group in the spring, and she said, I got the yearbook, and I opened it up, and I found that the picture of my child who had died at Sandy Hook was removed, as were the photographs of every child and adult who died that day. And she looked at us and she said, what were they thinking? It's like they never existed. Now, I didn't talk with them. I did coordinate the response for Sandy Hook for the first week. I had another position out of state, so I did not stay and continue to grow. So I can't really speak to what their thinking was, but I have talked to other schools. And they have suggested to me, well, we're not going to put a picture in the yearbook because it would be a trauma trigger. No, we don't put in pictures of the traumatic event. So gone over this with schools where no pictures of shooting, no pictures of people crying, but you don't remove the pictures of the people that died. So individuals, there are trauma triggers, but there are grief triggers. And grief triggers, people would prefer to have the grief triggers than to forget the person that died. That's why we have cemeteries. That's why we have funerals. Yes, they are triggering and remind us of the person who died, but worse to forget the person. So the issue is you can't use trauma approaches for everything. And I think it becomes important that we discern really what are we trying to manage and help someone with. And then the next thing that's on this slide is guilt. People somehow manage to find reasons to feel guilty, irrespective of their experience and role. At some level, at least unconsciously, individuals may choose to take guilt above feeling that they had no role. So one of the things you're most worried about when someone dies or there's been a crisis is, can it happen again to others I care about? So in order to decrease that anxiety of a fear of recurrence, you reassure yourself you were responsible for the first loss, because then there's something you can do to prevent the next one. You can change your behavior, and somehow that will be protective. So individuals may assume guilt because it comes with an illusion of control. But this is the harsh reality, is it's an illusion of control. So it doesn't work, it doesn't prevent further loss or crisis in your life, and it leaves you with guilt that makes it hard to cope with the event that's occurred or the loss that's occurred. We also see survivor guilt, and I've even seen guilt for not having experienced loss or trauma that others experienced, kind of similar to kind of the survivor guilt. So guilt is very common. If you go to the next slide, I'm going to have to go through these 4 slides. I'm going to see if I can read it. He calls in, he says, Mom, a big dog knocked me down and you stole bombs. Go on to the next slide. And he says, I tried to catch him, but I couldn't, and now I've lost his best friend. Go to the next slide. And his mother says, well, Carolyn, if we wouldn't drag that tiger everywhere, things like this wouldn't happen. You go to the next slide, he points out, there's no problems. So often you can't add some guilt to it and make it even worse. So please look for the guilt. I actually say to children and adults, when bad things happen, we feel bad, and we always assume we did something bad. Thoughts and feelings don't make people dark. A lot of kids tell me that they think maybe they caused it. Have you ever felt that way? And kids will share with me their stories. I would say in doing the work for over 30 years, I have really only found about 2 or 3 times when there wasn't at least one person who felt guilty after a death had occurred. It's so common. And it is not just children, it's adults as well. Now, all the reactions that I went through may be due to the particular crisis itself, but it may also be due to the wide range of other stressors that are associated with the crisis. I remember in one of my trips to New Orleans, one of the teachers said to me, you know, when Katrina hit, I was actually renting in the French Quarter, and I was lucky. My apartment was, the French Quarter was higher above water. She said there wasn't any flooding of the building I was renting. And she said there wasn't any wind damage either. My apartment was undamaged. She said, so I was lucky for about 3 or 4 months. And then the rent increased because there wasn't affordable housing anymore. So she said, well, I worked for the school system, so I couldn't afford the double it with my rent. So there wasn't any affordable housing that was nearby, so I took about 45 minutes away. So she said, so I functionally live out of the trunk of my car. The real problem was I had to remove my daughter from high school. And she then became depressed when she was separated from her friends and contacts and placed in school. So I took her to the emergency department and she got started on antidepressants, but I couldn't get the counseling that they recommended. Probably there were many barriers to that. So she said, so someone suggested, why don't I get her a pet? Dogs will help her feel this. She said, so I got her a dog, but the dog attacked someone in the throat, and I'm going to court next week, and the attorney tells me I will likely be bankrupt after next week. So she didn't have any problems with the hurricane, but her whole life fell apart afterwards. And now, that is what is happening to people now. They might not have gotten sick with COVID, they might not have had anyone that died, but yes, crises are going on. These things happen in these crisis situations, in these cascades of secondary losses and stressors. So we have to be careful. We can't just ask things like, was your home damaged in Katrina? That's one question. We should be asking more broadly, how have you been doing? And then really show that we care about that question and find out what their life is like. Now so it's not just the crisis, it's everything that followed the crisis. This is where it gets even more. It's not just that. It's everything that preceded the crisis can come to the surface. So a crisis often awakens feelings related to pre-existing or even past crisis events that weren't fully resolved, that may now become the primary focus for the child or an adult. There was one school that they had gone on a field trip. It's a high school class. And while they were on the bus, one of the girls had a necklace that had a bottle, the clear bottle with some fluid in it. So she opened it up on the bus, and she was curious, and I don't really know her motivation. And she didn't realize it was a personal protective device. So it has the liquid concentrate of what's in pepper spray. She goes to open it and are attacked or threatened. I don't know who gives gifts to children, but anyway, why she's wearing it on a field trip, but anyway, she was. And she did open it, and the bus got filled with fumes. Kids were in trouble breathing, asthma attacks, vomiting. So they evacuate the bus and they go into a fast food restaurant. She brings it with her to a fast food restaurant. She contaminates the fast food restaurant. Nobody knows what's going on. So they like call the authorities and they're like, this is probably a chemical terrorist event, and we're going to do mass decontamination to everyone in the restaurant. At what point she says, oh no, like my fault, like this is the bottle. They put the cap on it. That's all they needed to do. Now, yes, the kids still smelled, the bus smelled, they had to get a new bus, they had to get new clothes, but it was over. That was it. So they get in the bus, they get in a clean bus, and they go to a children's hospital and they shower in the ambulance bed. So they have showers out of the ambulance bed, but they went to. So they have the boys go one at a time into one shower, the girls go one at a time into another shower, so that no boy saw a girl undressed or vice versa. And then they had the wherewithal to remove the teacher and all the chaperones and have them shower inside the hospital. Because seeing your teacher naked is a traumatic event, probably not pleasant for the teacher. So they took care of all of this and did well. They clean clothes, they gave them clean clothes, they dressed them in these new clothes. And then they gathered in a room about this size, it was an auditorium, which means possible. They gave them cookies and punch. They played cartoons. Can you imagine this? Why would you do that with teenagers? But they're playing cartoons, they're feeding them cookies and punch. They have child life specialists to help them through this experience. Anyway, I'm like, what are you doing? Just give them back their cell phones. It's so cool when you get to text people. I've been in the hospital, just deconned in the hospital. That's so cool. So nobody was dying. Everyone knew it was just a mistake. It's no big deal. So the school then comes up to me and they go, a couple weeks later, we have 2 girls and they're having panic attacks and they can't come back to school. What did we do wrong? And I'm like, what did you do wrong? Cookies and punch and cartoons? That was so over the top. That was like too good. It was completely unnecessary. I actually worked at that hospital. The cookies and punch were quite good. So I was like, good for you for the cookies and punch. Those are they actually had good punch and cookies. Anyway, I said that was fine, but the child life specialist was unnecessary. So they said that these 2 girls are having panic attacks and they can't come back to class. And I said, okay, I didn't mean them. I wasn't there. It has nothing to do with what happened that day. Find out about these children. There's something in your life, their lives are on top. So then they said, well, one of us is knitting. She just transferred here the week beforehand. She transferred there the week beforehand because her mother was murdered the week beforehand. They didn't know that little detail. So they were like, okay, you're right. That's probably what it is. Probably, but yes, that's what it was. So then the other girl, they said, she's fine. She hasn't had any adverse childhood experiences. She's not had stress at home. Her parents said she's fine. She said she's fine. What did we do wrong? I said, okay, please stop talking about what happened that day. She just hasn't told you what's happened yet. Look further. She finally came forward and said she was being sexually assaulted by her father. That was what was going on at home. So the issue is, you got to deal with a crisis. You don't deal with a crisis. Deal with everything that's followed and everything that's preceded. And that's why this work is so difficult. It's because you uncover a lot. And there's a lot of adverse experiences in children's lives, as there are in adults' lives. So let me now talk about the recovery and renewal. So let's spend just a moment talking about the process. If we go to the next slide. We have that, okay, that slide's usually set up automated, but it is not, so that is fine. So in crisis situations, you find that there's a baseline. So kind of from, I don't think you can see the letters, from the first line from A to B, it isn't a straight line. So people have things that happen that are positive in their lives, and they feel better, and you can find a $20 bill. You don't have to go to class for a day, you need to go to a conference that's really well put together. Or something bad happens, so speaking of the drugs on, which you find really normal. And so you have good things and bad things that occur. So every time you see someone in distress, do not believe that they're in crisis. They're just in distress. You can have go to bed with our baselines not straight lines, is the point I'm trying to make. But the issue is that crisis events are actually not defined by the events. A crisis event is an event that the individual or the system does not have the capacity to respond to and recover from without external support. So resilient individuals do not necessarily experience any less distress than anyone else. They just can cope with it. The reason I go over that is if someone is having distress, help them, even if they could take care of it. This is why I help people go, well, I was seeing this during the pandemic. You know, people who do bereavement work still grieve when people close to them die, and we should still be kind to them and supportive to them, even though they, quote, know what to do, it's still hard. So then what happens is a crisis event occurs, and that overwhelms the individual or the system's capacity to cope, and they start to have a drop in adjustment over time. Once you get down to the nadir or by the bottom, usually people come in and provide support. This is one of the problems with the pandemic, is that there was no cavalry. There weren't outsiders who weren't affected who could come in and help. Everybody was affected in the world. And so usually that isn't the case. Usually there are people who can come, provide support and assistance. And then there is some improvement. People have called that kind of the honeymoon period, because what happens is the same thing as when you get married. People gather together, they bring food generally, and cash. So it's kind of like a honeymoon. And things get better for a little while. I don't call it the honeymoon period because that suggests that marriage is a disaster. Too many people agree with that, and it just uncovers other issues. So I don't actually use the term honeymoon period, but that is what some people call it. So there is some improvement, and you'll see that the adjustment starts to increase. Often what we do is we stop giving support as soon as kids start to get better. We go, look, they're better. Well, they're relatively better, but they're not all better. If you withdraw the support too soon, some children stay at that and establish a new baseline, just continue in parenting. The other thing that I will say is when people start to do better, which is for some crisis events, weeks or months afterwards, that is actually when they're most vulnerable. So when we see the natural disasters, it's a challenge with adults, not children. And large-scale natural disasters and suicide rates increase several months afterwards, not at the worst moment. People kind of immobilized when they're really depressed and overwhelmed, but what happens is things start to get better, and some people erroneously conclude that everyone else is back to normal except them, and they don't think they're going to make it back, and that leads to the despair that's associated with suicide. So in New Orleans, about 3 to 4 months after Katrina, during my visits then, people could list those in healthcare that they knew had killed themselves since the hurricane. Actually, a supplement to the journal Pediatrics was dedicated to a young pediatrician who killed himself in New Orleans after Katrina. That is the vulnerable time period. That is when we started withdrawing support. That's problematic. So the increase in suicides that we're seeing now, again, predicted. It's not usually in the height of the crisis. It's when people think they're supposed to be over it. Now, you can have some during the crisis event, particularly like the pandemic when it was prolonged, but the after period, kind of the aftermath, for a couple of months later, is a particularly vulnerable time when we should be providing extra support. So what we need to do is get kids back up to that second line, which is a return to their baseline. But if you give enough support and the person has enough internal capacity and resiliency, most people don't get to this point, but some people will exceed their baseline, and that's called post-traumatic growth. They will actually emerge with a sense of what is right and what has purpose in their life. New heightened degrees of spirituality, more of a desire to be empathic, to help others. People switch careers to helping professions. So I was giving this presentation to a community impacted by a major natural disaster. And these were foster parents I was talking to. One dad raised his hand and goes, wait, I think that's me. And so he told me, I worked on Wall Street. He was a young guy. He said, I worked on Wall Street and I was really successful. I was making a lot of money. And I was happily married, and I had a toddler, and I thought I had everything. Then my toddler got sick and died. He goes, and I started to question everything in my life. And I thought, you know what? I don't have career, I have a job. What do? I make money for people, and in the process, I make money. But I don't make the world a better place. This isn't a career, this is a job. I want a career. So he told me, I quit my successful job on Wall Street, and I went back to college to become a kindergarten teacher. He goes, saving, shaping the lives of a young child, that's a career. I can devote myself to that. And I felt like saying, you did know you're gonna make less, right? Like, you thought this through. You had to pay for college, all of that. So, but he was, and he said, and then I became a foster parent, and I'm adopting my child now. And he goes, is that post-traumatic growth? And I'm like, yes. But then what I'm thinking is, because this is what you see all the time in mental health, pediatrics, healthcare in general, education in general, you get a lot of people there who had difficult experiences during their childhood, either for themselves or someone they cared about, and they experienced post-traumatic growth. So why do I go through this with you? Because individuals who have gone through post-traumatic growth have gone through trauma, and it tends to be uncovered when you help others. So the very people that go into helping professions are most likely to be hurt by helping people. That is the irony. And so if you don't care about people and you're not empathic, you really don't get hurt by helping them. But you're not very good at helping them. So that's the problem. I was a pediatrician chief at a children's hospital, and people go, well, these employees, and they do this, and then they need time off. And I go, you know what works best? You hire people who need children. Because then they're efficient. I mean, they're jerks, but they're efficient. So you also want people who don't want to have children of their own, because otherwise they have that maternity leave, which is really difficult to schedule over. So, but the problem is, if you get them and they don't have children, then they want to have children. So it's better to hire people that have children and don't like them, because then they don't want time off with them, and they're not going to want more of them. And I go, but then I don't like them, and I don't want to be around them. So that is the irony of this. So why is that important? Because the last thing I'm going to go over is professional self-care. Go on to the next slide. It's important to recognize this distressing to people in general, and children in particular, when they are in distress after a crisis. So professionals have to appreciate and address the impact of supporting children who are either grieving or traumatized, whether that has an impact on them personally or professionally, or both. We have to have a culture where it's okay to be upset when upsetting things happen. I saw a lot of people during the pandemic telling me these horrible stories and saying morale is poor, and I go, you think? Like, yes, it's a bad situation. Morale will not be very good. And we have to accept the fact that sometimes upsetting things upset us, even when we are professional. Go to the next slide. Exposure to the trauma and suffering of others can lead to compassion fatigue. Empathy involves understanding and taking the perspective of another person. The compassion goes beyond that. It requires empathy, but it includes the additional step of wanting to help and or desiring to relieve the suffering of another. So the word compassion has two Latin roots, which mean to bear or suffer together. And it's that together part that brings on the compassion fatigue. So I find that people talk about compassion fatigue, and then it's always followed with, compassion is necessarily exhausting, and if you care too much or about too many people, you're going to run out of your compassion. And it doesn't really work that way. Compassionate care approaches can be gratifying and they can bring meaning to the work that we do, but it does come at a cost to the healthcare professional and to the educator. Go to the next slide. It is most likely to be of positive benefit to the professional when they have realistic objectives and the purpose of their interactions. So if you're trying to help someone who's grieving, you're not trying to make them happy, you're trying to help them cope with their sadness. The goal is not to take away their distress. You also have to feel that you have the skills and the resources to provide assistance which you believe is meaningful. And you also have to be aware of and have sufficient support to deal with the personal impact work is having on you. Compassion does require more emotional effort, but it's like exercise. When you first start doing it, you get exhausted earlier, but you build your capacity as you continue to exercise. You build your capacity to provide compassionate care, the more compassionate you are, as long as you're taking care of yourself and not exceeding your capacity during that process. And then compassionate care brings meaning to the work we do, and that decreases burnout, doesn't increase it. So it's not that you're too compassionate, it's that maybe you're going beyond your limit at the time. But we don't ever want to go in the direction of decreasing compassion and empathy. That will not protect us. It will hurt children and it will hurt ourselves too. Along those lines, staff should also be aware that hearing the trauma stories of individuals impacted by the crisis, when you are empathic, can cause vicarious traumatization. So if you're a classroom educator, you don't need to process their trauma. You shouldn't. You should instead find out enough so that you need to get help. And you can tell people, like, that sounds like that's really difficult. Let me find someone who can talk to about it. You don't have to listen to their whole story. It is helpful for them to keep repeating it over and over with people who can't help them process it, and it isn't useful for you to keep hearing it. So all of this underscores the need for professional self-care. If you go to the next slide, we need to realize that there are sort of barriers. Allocating time when there's much to do and everyone seems to need your help is one barrier. So you have to realize that you're not helping yourself instead of helping people. You're helping yourself so that you can help people. Feeling shame or guilt for attending to your own needs ahead of those of others, again, is related to that. And then assuming others are somehow having less trouble adjusting than you. So when children hide their distress, adults do it better, professionals do it even better. This is not a superpower, it's a problem. We need to be able to express when we have distress, cope with that distress, but we have to express it. We have to, because the last barrier is a lack of modeling of professional self-care by those who village it. Take care of yourself, take care of your colleagues, and model that that's effective too. So I'm just going to end here and say that there's, get further, if you go to the next slide, further information about the center and free resources at our website. These slides are going to be made available to you. And then the last resource that I'm going to share with you in a couple slides is the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. Go to the next slide. This is a unique collaboration of 10 of the leading educational professional organizations in the United States, 2 representing teachers' unions, 4 school superintendent, school principal, school administrator organizations, and major organizations, ASCA for school counselors, NASM for school nurses, NAS for school psychologists, and School Social Work Association of America. We came together 10 years ago to create the Coalition to Support Grieving Students, and those groups represent about 5 million school professionals. We launched the website in 2015. And after we launched the website, if you go to the next slide, more than 100 other professional organizations joined. Such as the National PTA, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Boys and Girls Club, Save the Children, a long list, and over 135 organizations. We continue to meet. We have our next meeting virtually next month, and then we're planning to move to Washington again in the spring. If you go to the next slide, we created this website, grievingstudents.org. It's over 20 video-based modules, most of them 10-15 minutes long, that cover a wide range of topics on how to support grieving students. They're PDF summaries of every modules. They're all free of charge. Available to the general public, but you have to register for the site. If you go to the next slide, we have a lot of other resources which I won't go over in some time. And then if you go to the next slide, we have this booklet, After a Loved One Dies. It can be freely downloaded. It is now in 9 languages, and so you can download them in a wide range of languages, photocopy and distribute them. And then the last slide, as promised, is the contact information for the center. So I'm going to just open it up to questions for 3 minutes. Then what I am going to do is there's a QR code that's going to follow. If you could fill out 6 quick questions, it takes less than a minute. Send that information to Brave Farm. So they will continue to support. So any questions? QR codes. Good. Does anyone have questions or comments? Because of the light of your eyes, so you can shout it. I can't see where Eric is. Assuming the right thing would be, we'll stop now for the break. And if people have questions for me that wish to ask in person, please do. And you can approach me at any point if you have questions. But thank you for your attention.